The Scarlet Pimpernel by Baroness Orczy. Part 5, Chapter 21. Suspense. It was late into the night when she at last reached the Fisherman's Rest. She had done the whole journey in less than 8 hours, thanks to innumerable changes of horses at the various coaching stations, for which she always paid lavishly, thus obtaining the very best and swiftest that could be had. Her coachman, too, had been indefatigable. The promise of special and rich reward had no doubt helped to keep him up, and he had literally burned the ground beneath his mistress' coach wheels. The arrival of Lady Blakeney in the middle of the night caused a considerable flutter at the Fisherman's Rest. Sally jumped hastily out of bed, and Mr. Jellyband was at great pains how to make his important guest comfortable. Both these good folk were far too well drilled in the manners appertaining to innkeepers to exhibit the slightest surprise at Lady Blakeney's arrival, alone, at this extraordinary hour. No doubt they thought all the more, but Marguerite was far too absorbed in the importance, the deadly earnestness, of her journey to stop and ponder over trifles of that sort. The coffee room, the scene lately of the dastardly outrage on 2 English gentlemen, was quite deserted. Mr. Jellyband hastily relit the lamp, rekindled a cheerful bit of fire in the great hearth, and then wheeled a comfortable chair by it, into which Marguerite gratefully sank. "Will your ladyship stay the night?" asked pretty Miss Sally, who was already busy laying a snow-white cloth on the table, preparatory to providing a simple supper for her ladyship. "No, not the whole night," replied Marguerite. "At any rate, I shall not want any room but this, if I can have it to myself for an hour or 2. "It is at your ladyship's service," said honest Jellyband, whose rubicund face was set in its tightest folds, lest it should betray before the quality that boundless astonishment which the worthy fellow had begun to feel. "I shall be crossing over at the first turn of the tide," said Marguerite, "and in the first schooner I can get. But my coachman and men will stay the night, and probably several days longer, so I hope you will make them comfortable." "Yes, my lady. I'll look after them." "Shall Sally bring your ladyship some supper?" "Yes, please. Put something cold on the table, and as soon as Sir Andrew Ffoulkes comes, show him in here." "Yes, my lady." Honest Jellyband's face now expressed distress in spite of himself. He had great regard for Sir Percy Blakeney, and did not like to see his lady running away with young Sir Andrew. Of course, it was no business of his, and Mr. Jellyband was no gossip. Still, in his heart, he recollected that her ladyship was after all only one of them foreigners. What wonder that she was immoral like the rest of them? "Don't sit up, honest Jellyband," continued Marguerite, kindly, "nor you either, Mistress Sally. Sir Andrew may be late." Jellyband was only too willing that Sally should go to bed. He was beginning not to like these goings-on at all. Still, Lady Blakeney would pay handsomely for the accommodation, and it certainly was no business of his. Sally arranged a simple supper of cold meat, wine, and fruit on the table. Then, with a respectful curtsy, she retired, wondering in her little mind why her ladyship looked so serious when she was about to elope with her gallant. Then commenced a period of weary waiting for Marguerite. She knew that Sir Andrew, who would have to provide himself with clothes befitting a lackey, could not possibly reach Dover for at least a couple of hours. He was a splendid horseman, of course, and would make light in such an emergency of the 70-odd miles between London and Dover. He would, too, literally burn the ground beneath his horse's hoofs, but he might not always get very good remounts, and in any case he could not have started from London until at least an hour after she did. She had seen nothing of Chauvelin on the road. Her coachman, whom she questioned, had not seen anyone answering the description his mistress gave him of the wizened figure of the little Frenchman. Evidently, therefore, he had been ahead of her all the time. She had not dared to question the people at the various inns, where they had stopped to change horses. She feared that Chauvelin had spies all along the route, who might overhear her questions, then outdistance her, and warn her enemy of her approach. Now she wondered at what inn he might be stopping, or whether he had had the good luck of chartering a vessel already, and was now himself on the way to France. That thought gripped her at the heart, as with an iron vice. If indeed she should be too late already. The loneliness of the room overwhelmed her. Everything within was so horribly still. The ticking of the grandfather's clock, dreadfully slow and measured, was the only sound which broke this awful loneliness. Marguerite had need of all her energy, all her steadfastness of purpose, to keep up her courage through this weary midnight waiting. Everyone else in the house, but herself, must have been asleep. She had heard Sally go upstairs. Mr. Jellyband had gone to see to her coachman and men, and then had returned and taken up a position under the porch outside, just where Marguerite had first met Chauvelin about a week ago. He evidently meant to wait up for Sir Andrew Ffoulkes, but was soon overcome by sweet slumbers, for presently, in addition to the slow ticking of the clock, Marguerite could hear the monotonous and dulcet tones of the worthy fellow's breathing. For some time now, she had realized that the beautiful warm October's day, so happily begun, had turned into a rough and cold night. She had felt very chilly, and was glad of the cheerful blaze in the hearth. But gradually, as time wore on, the weather became more rough, and the sound of the great breakers against the Admiralty Pier, though some distance from the inn, came to her as the noise of muffled thunder. The wind was becoming boisterous, rattling the leaded windows and the massive doors of the old-fashioned house. It shook the trees outside and roared down the vast chimney. Marguerite wondered if the wind would be favorable for her journey. She had no fear of the storm, and would have braved worse risks sooner than delay the crossing by an hour. A sudden commotion outside roused her from her meditations. Evidently, it was Sir Andrew Ffoulkes, just arrived in mad haste, for she heard his horse's hoofs thundering on the flagstones outside, then Mr. Jellyband's sleepy, yet cheerful tones bidding him welcome. For a moment, then, the awkwardness of her position struck Marguerite. Alone at this hour, in a place where she was well known, and having made an assignation with a young cavalier equally well known, and who arrives in disguise. What food for gossip to those mischievously inclined? The idea struck Marguerite chiefly from its humorous side. There was such quaint contrast between the seriousness of her errand and the construction which would naturally be put on her actions by honest Mr. Jellyband, that for the first time since many hours, a little smile began playing round the corners of her childlike mouth, and when, presently, Sir Andrew, almost unrecognizable in his lackey-like garb, entered the coffee-room, she was able to greet him with quite a merry laugh. "Faith, monsieur, my lackey," she said, "I am satisfied with your appearance." Mr. Jellyband had followed Sir Andrew, looking strangely perplexed. The young gallant's disguise had confirmed his worst suspicions. Without a smile upon his jovial face, he drew the cork from the bottle of wine, set the chairs ready, and prepared to wait. "Thanks, honest friend," said Marguerite, who was still smiling at the thought of what the worthy fellow must be thinking at that very moment. "We shall require nothing more, and here's for all the trouble you have been put to on our account." She handed 2 or 3 gold pieces to Jellyband, who took them respectfully and with becoming gratitude. "Stay, Lady Blakeney," interposed Sir Andrew, as Jellyband was about to retire. "I am afraid we shall require something more of my friend Jelly's hospitality. I am sorry to say we cannot cross over tonight." "Not cross over tonight," she repeated in amazement. "But we must, Sir Andrew, we must." "There can be no question of cannot, and whatever it may cost, we must get a vessel tonight." But the young man shook his head sadly. "I am afraid it is not a question of cost, Lady Blakeney. There is a nasty storm blowing from France. The wind is dead against us. We cannot possibly sail until it is changed." Marguerite became deadly pale. She had not foreseen this. Nature herself was playing her a horrible, cruel trick. Percy was in danger, and she could not go to him, because the wind happened to blow from the coast of France. "But we must go. We must," she repeated with strange, persistent energy. "You know, we must go. Can't you find a way?" "I have been down to the shore already," he said, "and had to talk to 1 or 2 skippers. It is quite impossible to set sail tonight, so every sailor assured me. No one," he added, looking significantly at Marguerite, "no one could possibly put out of Dover tonight." Marguerite at once understood what he meant. No one included Chauvelin as well as herself. She nodded pleasantly to Jellyband. "Well then, I must resign myself," she said to him. "Have you a room for me?" "Oh, yes, your ladyship. A nice, bright, airy room. I'll see to it at once. And there is another one for Sir Andrew. Both quite ready." "That's brave now, mine honest jelly," said Sir Andrew, gaily, and clapping his worthy host vigorously on the back. "You unlock both those rooms, and leave our candles here on the dresser. I vow you are dead with sleep, and her ladyship must have some supper before she retires. There, have no fear, friend of the rueful countenance, her ladyship's visit, though at this unusual hour, is a great honour to thy house, and Sir Percy Blakeney will reward thee doubly, if thou sayest well to her privacy and comfort." Sir Andrew had no doubt guessed the many conflicting doubts and fears which raged in honest Jellyband's head, and as he was a gallant gentleman, he tried by this brave hint to allay some of the worthy innkeeper's suspicions. He had the satisfaction of seeing that he had partially succeeded. Jellyband's rubicund countenance brightened somewhat at mention of Sir Percy's name. "I'll go and see to it at once, sir," he said with alacrity and with less frigidity in his manner. "Has her ladyship everything she wants for supper?" "Everything, thanks, honest friend. And as I am famished and dead with fatigue, I pray you see to the rooms. Now tell me," she said eagerly, as soon as Jellyband had gone from the room, "tell me all your news." "There is nothing else much to tell you, Lady Blakeney," replied the young man. "The storm makes it quite impossible for any vessel to put out of Dover this tide. But what seemed to you at first a terrible calamity is really a blessing in disguise. If we cannot cross over to France tonight, Chauvelin is in the same quandary. He may have left before the storm broke out." "God grant he may," said Sir Andrew merrily, "for very likely then he'll have been driven out of his course. Who knows? He may now even be lying at the bottom of the sea, for there is a furious storm raging, and it will fare ill with all small craft which happen to be out. But I fear me we cannot build our hopes upon the shipwreck of that cunning devil and of all his murderous plans. The sailors I spoke to all assured me that no schooner had put out of Dover for several hours. On the other hand, I ascertained that a stranger had arrived by coach this afternoon, and had, like myself, made some inquiries about crossing over to France. Then Chauvelin is still in Dover? Undoubtedly. Shall I go waylay him and run my sword through him? That were indeed the quickest way out of the difficulty. Nay, Sir Andrew, do not jest. Alas, I have often since last night caught myself wishing for that fiend's death. But what you suggest is impossible. The laws of this country do not permit of murder. It is only in our beautiful France that wholesale slaughter is done lawfully, in the name of liberty and of brotherly love." Sir Andrew had persuaded her to sit down to the table, to partake of some supper, and to drink a little wine. This enforced rest of at least 12 hours, until the next tide, was sure to be terribly difficult to bear in the state of intense excitement in which she was. Obedient in these small matters like a child, Marguerite tried to eat and drink. Sir Andrew, with that profound sympathy born in all those who are in love, made her almost happy by talking to her about her husband. He recounted to her some of the daring escapes the brave Scarlet Pimpernel had contrived for the poor French fugitives, whom a relentless and bloody revolution was driving out of their country. He made her eyes glow with enthusiasm by telling her of his bravery, his ingenuity, his resourcefulness, when it meant snatching the lives of men, women, and even children from beneath the very edge of that murderous, ever-ready guillotine. He even made her smile quite merrily by telling her of the Scarlet Pimpernel's quaint and many disguises, through which he had baffled the strictest watch set against him at the barricades of Paris. This last time, the escape of the Comtesse de Tournay and her children had been a veritable masterpiece. Blakeney, disguised as a hideous old market woman, in filthy cap and straggling gray locks, was a sight fit to make the gods laugh. Marguerite laughed heartily as Sir Andrew tried to describe Blakeney's appearance, whose gravest difficulty always consisted in his great height, which in France made disguise doubly difficult. Thus an hour wore on. There were many more to spend in enforced inactivity in Dover. Marguerite rose from the table with an impatient sigh. She looked forward with dread to the night in the bed upstairs, with terribly anxious thoughts to keep her company, and the howling of the storm to help chase sleep away. She wondered where Percy was now. The Daydream was a strong, well-built, sea-going yacht. Sir Andrew had expressed the opinion that no doubt she had got in the lee of the wind before the storm broke out, or else perhaps had not ventured into the open at all, but was lying quietly at Gravesend. Briggs was an expert skipper, and Sir Percy handled a schooner as well as any master mariner. There was no danger for them from the storm. It was long past midnight when at last Marguerite retired to rest. As she had feared, sleep sedulously avoided her eyes. Her thoughts were of the blackest during these long, weary hours, whilst that incessant storm raged which was keeping her away from Percy. The sound of the distant breakers made her heart ache with melancholy. She was in the mood when the sea has a saddening effect upon the nerves. It is only when we are very happy that we can bear to gaze merrily upon the vast and limitless expanse of water, rolling on and on with such persistent, irritating monotony, to the accompaniment of our thoughts, whether grave or gay. When they are gay, the waves echo their gaiety, but when they are sad, then every breaker, as it rolls, seems to bring additional sadness, and to speak to us of hopelessness and of the pettiness of all our joys. Chapter 22. Calais. The weariest nights, the longest days, sooner or later must perforce come to an end. Marguerite had spent over 15 hours in such acute mental torture as well-nigh drove her crazy. After a sleepless night, she rose early, wild with excitement, dying to start on her journey, terrified lest further obstacles lay in her way. She rose before anyone else in the house was astir, so frightened was she, lest she should miss the one golden opportunity of making a start. When she came downstairs, she found Sir Andrew Ffoulkes sitting in the coffee-room. He had been out half an hour earlier, and had gone to the Admiralty Pier, only to find that neither the French packet nor any privately chartered vessel could put out of Dover yet. The storm was then at its fullest, and the tide was on the turn. If the wind did not abate or change, they would perforce have to wait another 10 or 12 hours until the next tide before a start could be made. And the storm had not abated, the wind had not changed, and the tide was rapidly drawing out. Marguerite felt the sickness of despair when she heard this melancholy news. Only the most firm resolution kept her from totally breaking down, and thus adding to the young man's anxiety, which evidently had become very keen. Though he tried to disguise it, Marguerite could see that Sir Andrew was just as anxious as she was to reach his comrade and friend. This enforced inactivity was terrible to them both. How they spent that wearisome day at Dover, Marguerite could never afterwards say. She was in terror of showing herself, lest Chauvelin's spies happened to be about. So she had a private sitting room, and she and Sir Andrew sat there hour after hour, trying to take, at long intervals, some perfunctory meals, which little Sally would bring them, with nothing to do but to think, to conjecture, and only occasionally to hope. The storm had abated just too late. The tide was by then too far out to allow a vessel to put off to sea. The wind had changed and was settling down to a comfortable northwesterly breeze, a veritable godsend for a speedy passage across to France. And there those two waited, wondering if the hour would ever come when they could finally make a start. There had been one happy interval in this long, weary day, and that was when Sir Andrew went down once again to the pier and presently came back to tell Marguerite that he had chartered a quick schooner, whose skipper was ready to put to sea the moment the tide was favorable. From that moment, the hours seemed less wearisome. There was less hopelessness in the waiting. And at last, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Marguerite, closely veiled and followed by Sir Andrew Ffoulkes, who, in the guise of her lackey, was carrying a number of impedimenta, found her way down to the pier. Once on board, the keen, fresh sea air revived her. The breeze was just strong enough to nicely swell the sails of the foam crest, as she cut her way merrily towards the open. The sunset was glorious after the storm, and Marguerite, as she watched the white cliffs of Dover gradually disappearing from view, felt more at peace and once more almost hopeful. Sir Andrew was full of kind attentions, and she felt how lucky she had been to have him by her side in this, her great trouble. Gradually the gray coast of France began to emerge from the fast-gathering evening mists. 1 or 2 lights could be seen flickering, and the spires of several churches to rise out of the surrounding haze. Half an hour later Marguerite had landed upon French shore. She was back in that country where at this very moment men slaughtered their fellow creatures by the hundreds and sent innocent women and children in thousands to the block. The very aspect of the country and its people, even in this remote seacoast town, spoke of that seething revolution. 300 miles away, in beautiful Paris, now rendered hideous by the constant flow of the blood of her noblest sons, by the wailing of the widows, and the cries of fatherless children. The men all wore red caps, in various stages of cleanliness, but all with the tricolor cockade pinned on the left-hand side. Marguerite noticed with a shudder that, instead of the laughing, merry countenance habitual to her own countrymen, their faces now invariably wore a look of sly distrust. Every man nowadays was a spy upon his fellows. The most innocent word uttered in jest might at any time be brought up as a proof of aristocratic tendencies, or of treachery against the people. Even the women went about with a curious look of fear and of hate lurking in their brown eyes, and all watched Marguerite as she stepped on shore, followed by Sir Andrew, and murmured as she passed along, "Sacre Aristos," or else "Sacre Sanglais." Otherwise their presence excited no further comment. Calais, even in those days, was in constant business communication with England, and English merchants were often to be seen on this coast. It was well known that in view of the heavy duties in England, a vast deal of French wines and brandies were smuggled across. This pleased the French bourgeois immensely. He liked to see the English government and the English king, both of whom he hated, cheated out of their revenues. And an English smuggler was always a welcome guest at the tumble-down taverns of Calais and Boulogne. So perhaps, as Sir Andrew gradually directed Marguerite through the tortuous streets of Calais, many of the population, who turned with an oath to look at the strangers clad in the English fashion, thought that they were bent on purchasing dutiable articles for their own fog-ridden country, and gave them no more than a passing thought. Marguerite, however, wondered how her husband's tall, massive figure could have passed through Calais unobserved. She marveled what disguise he assumed to do his noble work, without exciting too much attention. Without exchanging more than a few words, Sir Andrew was leading her right across the town, to the other side from that where they had landed, and on the way towards Cap Gris-Nez. The streets were narrow, tortuous, and mostly evil-smelling, with a mixture of stale fish and damp cellar odors. There had been heavy rain here during the storm last night, and sometimes Marguerite sank ankle-deep in the mud, for the roads were not lighted save by the occasional glimmer from a lamp inside a house. But she did not heed any of these petty discomforts. "We may meet Blakeney at the Chat Gris," Sir Andrew had said, when they landed, and she was walking as if on a carpet of rose leaves, for she was going to meet him almost at once. At last they reached their destination. Sir Andrew evidently knew the road, for he had walked unerringly in the dark, and had not asked his way from anyone. It was too dark then for Marguerite to notice the outside aspect of this house. The Chat Gris, as Sir Andrew had called it, was evidently a small wayside inn on the outskirts of Calais, and on the way to Gris-Nez. It lay some little distance from the coast, for the sound of the sea seemed to come from afar. Sir Andrew knocked at the door with the knob of his cane, and from within Marguerite heard a sort of grunt and the muttering of a number of oaths. Sir Andrew knocked again, this time more peremptorily. More oaths were heard, and then shuffling steps seemed to draw near the door. Presently this was thrown open, and Marguerite found herself on the threshold of the most dilapidated, most squalid room she had ever seen in all her life. The paper, such as it was hanging from the walls in strips. There did not seem to be a single piece of furniture in the room that could, by the wildest stretch of imagination, be called whole. Most of the chairs had broken backs, others had no seats to them. One corner of the table was propped up with a bundle of faggots. There where the fourth leg had been broken. In one corner of the room there was a huge hearth, over which hung a stockpot, with a not altogether unpalatable odor of hot soup emanating therefrom. On one side of the room, high up in the wall, there was a species of loft, before which hung a tattered blue and white checked curtain. A rickety set of steps led up to this loft. On the great bare walls, with their colorless paper, all stained with varied filth, there were chalked up at intervals in great bold characters the words Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. The whole of this sordid abode was dimly lighted by an evil-smelling oil lamp, which hung from the rickety rafters of the ceiling. It all looked so horribly squalid, so dirty and uninviting, that Marguerite hardly dared to cross the threshold. Sir Andrew, however, had stepped unhesitatingly forward. "English travelers, citoyen," he said boldly and speaking in French. The individual who had come to the door in response to Sir Andrew's knock, and who presumably was the owner of this squalid abode, was an elderly, heavily built peasant, dressed in a dirty blue blouse, heavy sabots from which wisps of straw protruded all round, shabby blue trousers, and the inevitable red cap with the tricolor cockade that proclaimed his momentary political views. He carried a short wooden pipe, from which the odor of rank tobacco emanated. He looked with some suspicion and a great deal of contempt at the two travelers, muttered "sacres anglais," and spat upon the ground to further show his independence of spirit, but nevertheless he stood aside to let them enter, no doubt well aware that these same sacres anglais always had well-filled purses. "Oh, Lud," said Marguerite, as she advanced into the room, holding her handkerchief to her dainty nose. "What a dreadful hole! Are you sure this is the place?" "Aye, 'tis the place, sure enough," replied the young man as, with his lace-edged, fashionable handkerchief, he dusted a chair for Marguerite to sit on. "But I vow I never saw a more villainous hole." "Faith," she said, looking round with some curiosity and a great deal of horror at the dilapidated walls, the broken chairs, the rickety table, "it certainly does not look inviting." The landlord of the Chatgris, by name Brogard, had taken no further notice of his guests. He concluded that presently they would order supper, and in the meanwhile it was not for a free citizen to show deference or even courtesy to anyone, however smartly they might be dressed. By the hearth sat a huddled-up figure clad, seemingly, mostly in rags. That figure was apparently a woman, although even that would have been hard to distinguish, except for the cap which had once been white, and for what looked like the semblance of a petticoat. She was sitting mumbling to herself, and from time to time stirring the brew in her stock-pot. "Hey, my friend," said Sir Andrew at last, "we should like some supper. This thing there," he added, pointing to the huddled-up bundle of rags by the hearth, "is concocting some delicious soup, I'll warrant, and my mistress has not tasted food for several hours." It took Brogard some few moments to consider the question. A free citizen does not respond too readily to the wishes of those who happen to require something of him. "Sacres aristos," he murmured, and once more spat upon the ground. Then he went very slowly up to a dresser which stood in a corner of the room. From this he took an old pewter soup tureen and slowly, and without a word, he handed it to his better half, who, in the same silence, began filling the tureen with the soup out of her stock-pot. Marguerite had watched all these preparations with absolute horror. Were it not for the earnestness of her purpose, she would incontinently have fled from this abode of dirt and evil smells. "Faith, our host and hostess are not cheerful people," said Sir Andrew, seeing the look of horror on Marguerite's face. "I would I could offer you a more hearty and more appetizing meal, but I think you will find the soup eatable and the wine good. These people wallow in dirt, but live well as a rule." "Nay, I pray you, Sir Andrew," she said gently, "be not anxious about me. My mind is scarce inclined to dwell on thoughts of supper." Brogard was slowly pursuing his gruesome preparations. He had placed a couple of spoons, also 2 glasses on the table, both of which Sir Andrew took the precaution of wiping carefully. Brogard had also produced a bottle of wine and some bread, and Marguerite made an effort to draw her chair to the table and to make some pretense at eating. Sir Andrew, as befitting his role of lackey, stood behind her chair. "Nay, madam, I pray you," he said, seeing that Marguerite seemed quite unable to eat, "I beg of you to try and swallow some food. Remember you have need of all your strength." The soup certainly was not bad. It smelt and tasted good. Marguerite might have enjoyed it, but for the horrible surroundings. She broke the bread, however, and drank some of the wine. "Nay, Sir Andrew," she said, "I do not like to see you standing. You have need of food just as much as I have. This creature will only think that I am an eccentric Englishwoman eloping with her lackey, if you'll sit down and partake of this semblance of supper beside me." Indeed, Brogard, having placed what was strictly necessary upon the table, seemed not to trouble himself any further about his guests. The mere Brogard had quietly shuffled out of the room, and the man stood and lounged about, smoking his evil-smelling pipe, sometimes under Marguerite's very nose, as any free-born citizen who was anybody's equal should do. "Confound the brute," said Sir Andrew, with native British wrath, as Brogard leant up against the table, smoking and looking down superciliously at these two sacres anglais. "In heaven's name, man," admonished Marguerite, hurriedly, seeing that Sir Andrew, with British-born instinct, was ominously clenching his fist. "Remember that you are in France, and that in this year of grace this is the temper of the people." "I'd like to scrag the brute," muttered Sir Andrew, savagely. He had taken Marguerite's advice and sat next to her at table, and they were both making noble efforts to deceive one another by pretending to eat and drink. "I pray you," said Marguerite, "keep the creature in a good temper, so that he may answer the questions we must put to him. I'll do my best, but begad, I'd sooner scrag him than question him." "Hey, my friend," he said pleasantly in French, and tapping Brogard lightly on the shoulder. "Do you see many of our quality along these parts? Many English travelers, I mean?" Brogard looked round at him, over his near shoulder, puffed away at his pipe for a moment or two, as he was in no hurry, then muttered, "You sometimes—" "Ah," said Sir Andrew, carelessly, "English travelers always know where they can get good wine, eh? My friend? Now, tell me, my lady was desiring to know if by any chance you happen to have seen a great friend of hers, an English gentleman who often comes to Calais on business. He is tall, and recently was on his way to Paris. My lady hoped to have met him in Calais." Marguerite tried not to look at Brogard, lest she should betray before him the burning anxiety with which she waited for his reply. But a free-born French citizen is never in any hurry to answer questions. Brogard took his time. Then he said very slowly, "Tall Englishman? Today, yes." "You have seen him?" asked Sir Andrew, carelessly. "Yes, today," muttered Brogard sullenly. Then he quietly took Sir Andrew's hat from a chair close by, put it on his own head, tugged at his dirty blouse, and generally tried to express in pantomime that the individual in question wore very fine clothes. "Sacre aristo," he muttered, "that tall Englishman." Marguerite could scarce repress a scream. "It's Sir Percy right enough," she murmured, "and not even in disguise." She smiled, in the midst of all her anxiety, and through her gathering tears, at thought of the ruling passion strong in death, of Percy running into the wildest, maddest dangers, with the latest cut coat upon his back, and the laces of his jabot unruffled. "Oh, the foolhardiness of it," she sighed. "Quick, Sir Andrew," asked the man when he went. "Ah, yes, my friend," said Sir Andrew, addressing Brogard, with the same assumption of carelessness. "My lord always wears beautiful clothes. The tall Englishman you saw was certainly my lady's friend." "And he is gone, you say?" "He went, yes, but he's coming back. Here." "He ordered supper?" Sir Andrew put his hand with a quick gesture of warning upon Marguerite's arm. It came none too soon, for the next moment her wild, mad joy would have betrayed her. He was safe and well, was coming back here presently. She would see him in a few moments, perhaps. Oh! The wildness of her joy seemed almost more than she could bear. "Here," she said to Brogard, who seemed suddenly to have been transformed in her eyes into some heaven-born messenger of bliss. "Here! Did you say the English gentleman was coming back here?" The heaven-born messenger of bliss spat upon the floor to express his contempt for all and sundry aristos who chose to haunt the chat grille. "Hugh," he muttered, "he ordered supper. He'll come back. Sacre anglais," he added, by way of protest against all this fuss for a mere Englishman. "But where is he now?" "Do you know?" she asked eagerly, placing her dainty white hand upon the dirty sleeve of his blue blouse. "He went to get a horse and cart," said Brogard, laconically, as, with a surly gesture, he shook off from his arm that pretty hand which princes have been proud to kiss. "At what time did he go?" But Brogard had evidently had enough of these questionings. He did not think that it was fitting for a citizen, who was the equal of anybody, to be thus catechized by these sacred aristos, even though they were rich English ones. It was distinctly more fitting to his newborn dignity to be as rude as possible. It was a sure sign of servility to meekly reply to civil questions. "I don't know," he said surlily. "I have said enough, voyons, less aristos. He came today. He ordered supper. He went out. He'll come back. Voila!" And with this parting assertion of his rights as a citizen and a free man, to be as rude as he well pleased, Brogard shuffled out of the room, banging the door after him. Chapter 23. Hope. Faith, madam, said Sir Andrew, seeing that Marguerite seemed desirous to call her surly host back again. I think we'd better leave him alone. We shall not get anything more out of him, and we might arouse his suspicions. One never knows what spies may be lurking around these godforsaken places. What care I? She replied lightly. Now I know that my husband is safe, and that I shall see him almost directly. Hush, he said in genuine alarm, for she had talked quite loudly, in the fullness of her glee. The very walls have ears in France these days. He rose quickly from the table and walked round the bare, squalid room, listening attentively at the door, through which Brogard had just disappeared, and whence only muttered oaths and shuffling footsteps could be heard. He also ran up the rickety steps that led to the attic, to assure himself that there were no spies of Chauvelin's about the place. "Are we alone, monsieur, my lackey?" said Marguerite, gaily, as the young man once more sat down beside her. "May we talk?" As cautiously as possible, he entreated. "Faith, man, but you wear a glum face. As for me, I could dance with joy. Surely there is no longer any cause for fear. Our boat is on the beach, the foam crest not 2 miles out at sea, and my husband will be here, under this very roof, within the next half-hour perhaps. Sure, there is naught to hinder us. Chauvelin and his gang have not yet arrived. Nay, madam, that I fear we do not know." "What do you mean?" "He was at Dover at the same time that we were, held up by the same storm, which kept us from starting." "Exactly. But I did not speak of it before, for I feared to alarm you. I saw him on the beach not 5 minutes before we embarked. At least, I swore to myself at the time that it was himself. He was disguised as a cure, so that Satan, his own guardian, would scarce have known him. But I heard him then, bargaining for a vessel to take him swiftly to Calais, and he must have set sail less than an hour after we did." Marguerite's face had quickly lost its look of joy. The terrible danger in which Percy stood, now that he was actually on French soil, became suddenly and horribly clear to her. Chauvelin was close upon his heels. Here in Calais, the astute diplomatist was all-powerful. A word from him, and Percy could be tracked and arrested, and every drop of blood seemed to freeze in her veins. Not even during the moments of her wildest anguish in England had she so completely realized the imminence of the peril in which her husband stood. Chauvelin had sworn to bring the Scarlet Pimpernel to the guillotine, and now the daring plotter, whose anonymity hitherto had been a safeguard, stood revealed through her own hand to his most bitter, most relentless enemy. Chauvelin, when he waylaid Lord Tony and Sir Andrew Ffoulkes in the coffee-room of the Fisherman's Rest, had obtained possession of all the plans of this latest expedition. Armand St. Just, the Comte de Tournay and other fugitive royalists were to have met the Scarlet Pimpernel, or rather, as it had been originally arranged, 2 of his emissaries, on this day, the 2nd of October, at a place evidently known to the League, and vaguely alluded to as the Père Blanchard's hut. Armand, whose connection with the Scarlet Pimpernel and disavowal of the brutal policy of the Reign of Terror was still unknown to his countrymen, had left England a little more than a week ago, carrying with him the necessary instructions, which would enable him to meet the other fugitives and to convey them to this place of safety. This much Marguerite had fully understood from the first, and Sir Andrew Ffoulkes had confirmed her surmises. She knew, too, that when Sir Percy realized that his own plans and his directions to his lieutenants had been stolen by Chauvelin, it was too late to communicate with Armand or to send fresh instructions to the fugitives. They would, of necessity, be at the appointed time and place, not knowing how grave was the danger which now awaited their brave rescuer. Blakeney, who as usual had planned and organized the whole expedition, would not allow any of his younger comrades to run the risk of almost certain capture. Hence his hurried note to them at Lord Grenville's ball. "Start myself tomorrow alone." And now, with his identity known to his most bitter enemy, his every step would be dogged the moment he set foot in France. He would be tracked by Chauvelin's emissaries, followed until he reached that mysterious hut where the fugitives were waiting for him, and there the trap would be closed on him and on them. There was but 1 hour, The hour's start which Marguerite and Sir Andrew had of their enemy, in which to warn Percy of the imminence of his danger, and to persuade him to give up the foolhardy expedition, which could only end in his own death. But there was that 1 hour. Chauvelin knows of this inn from the papers he stole, said Sir Andrew, earnestly, and on landing will make straight for it. He has not landed yet, she said. We have an hour's start on him, and Percy will be here directly. We shall be mid-channel ere Chauvelin has realized that we have slipped through his fingers. She spoke excitedly and eagerly, wishing to infuse into her young friend some of that buoyant hope which still clung to her heart. But he shook his head sadly. Silent again, Sir Andrew, she said with some impatience. Why do you shake your head and look so glum? Faith, madam, he replied, 'tis only because in making your rose-colored plans, you are forgetting the most important factor. What in the world do you mean? I am forgetting nothing. What factor do you mean? She added with more impatience. It stands 6 foot odd high, replied Sir Andrew quietly, and half named Percy Blakeney. I don't understand, she murmured. Do you think that Blakeney would leave Calais without having accomplished what he set out to do? You mean? There's the old Comte de Tournay. The Comte, she murmured. And St. Just, and others. My brother, she said with a heartbroken sob of anguish. Heaven help me, but I fear I had forgotten. Fugitives as they are, these men at this moment await with perfect confidence and unshaken faith the arrival of the Scarlet Pimpernel, who has pledged his honor to take them safely across the Channel. Indeed, she had forgotten. With the sublime selfishness of a woman who loves with her whole heart, she had in the last 24 hours had no thoughts save for him. His precious, noble life, his danger. He, the loved one, the brave hero, he alone dwelt in her mind. My brother, she murmured, as one by one the heavy tears gathered in her eyes, as memory came back to her of Armand, the companion and darling of her childhood, the man for whom she had committed the deadly sin, which had so hopelessly imperiled her brave husband's life. Sir Percy Blakeney would not be the trusted, honored leader of a score of English gentlemen, said Sir Andrew, proudly, if he abandoned those who placed their trust in him. As for breaking his word, the very thought is preposterous. There was silence for a moment or two. Marguerite had buried her face in her hands and was letting the tears slowly trickle through her trembling fingers. The young man said nothing. His heart ached for this beautiful woman in her awful grief. All along he had felt the terrible impasse in which her own rash act had plunged them all. He knew his friend and leader so well, with his reckless daring, his mad bravery, his worship of his own word of honor. Sir Andrew knew that Blakeney would brave any danger, run the wildest risks sooner than break it, and with Chauvelin at his very heels, would make a final attempt, however desperate, to rescue those who trusted in him. Faith, Sir Andrew, said Marguerite at last, making brave efforts to dry her tears. You are right, and I would not now shame myself by trying to dissuade him from doing his duty. As you say, I should plead in vain. God grant him strength and ability, she added fervently and resolutely, to outwit his pursuers. He will not refuse to take you with him, perhaps, when he starts on his noble work. Between you, you will have cunning as well as valor. God guard you both. In the meanwhile, I think we should lose no time. I still believe that his safety depends upon his knowing that Chauvelin is on his track. Undoubtedly, he has wonderful resources at his command. As soon as he is aware of his danger, he will exercise more caution. His ingenuity is a veritable miracle. Then, what say you to a voyage of reconnaissance in the village whilst I wait here against his coming? You might come across Percy's track, and thus save valuable time. If you find him, tell him to beware. His bitterest enemy is on his heels. But this is such a villainous hole for you to wade in. Nay, that I do not mind. But you might ask our surly host if he could let me wait in another room, where I could be safer from the prying eyes of any chance traveler. Offer him some ready money, so that he should not fail to give me word the moment the tall Englishman returns. She spoke quite calmly, even cheerfully now, thinking out her plans, ready for the worst if need be. She would show no more weakness. She would prove herself worthy of him, who was about to give his life for the sake of his fellow men. Sir Andrew obeyed her without further comment. Instinctively, he felt that hers now was the stronger mind. He was willing to give himself over to her guidance, to become the hand, whilst she was the directing head. He went to the door of the inner room, through which Brogard and his wife had disappeared before, and knocked. As usual, he was answered by a salvo of muttered oaths. "Hey, friend Brogard," said the young man peremptorily, "my lady would wish to rest here a while. Could you give her the use of another room? She would wish to be alone." He took some money out of his pocket and allowed it to jingle significantly in his hand. Brogard had opened the door and listened, with his usual surly apathy, to the young man's request. At sight of the gold, however, his lazy attitude relaxed slightly. He took his pipe from his mouth and shuffled into the room. He then pointed over his shoulder at the attic up in the wall. "She can wait up there," he said with a grunt. "It's comfortable, and I have no other room." "Nothing could be better," said Marguerite in English. She at once realized the advantages such a position hidden from view would give her. "Give him the money, Sir Andrew. I shall be quite happy up there, and can see everything without being seen." She nodded to Brogard, who condescended to go up to the attic and to shake up the straw that lay on the floor. "May I entreat you, madam, to do nothing rash," said Sir Andrew, as Marguerite prepared in her turn to ascend the rickety flight of steps. "Remember, this place is infested with spies. Do not, I beg of you, reveal yourself to Sir Percy, unless you are absolutely certain that you are alone with him." Even as he spoke, he felt how unnecessary was this caution. Marguerite was as calm, as clear-headed as any man. There was no fear of her doing anything that was rash. "Nay," she said with a slight attempt at cheerfulness, "that can I faithfully promise you. I would not jeopardize my husband's life, nor yet his plans, by speaking to him before strangers. Have no fear, I will watch my opportunity, and serve him in the manner I think he needs it most." Brogard had come down the steps again, and Marguerite was ready to go up to her safe retreat. "I dare not kiss your hand, madam," said Sir Andrew, as she began to mount the steps, "since I am your lackey, but I pray you be of good cheer. If I do not come across Blakeney in half an hour, I shall return, expecting to find him here. Yes, that will be best. We can afford to wait for half an hour. Chauvelin cannot possibly be here before that. God grant that either you or I may have seen Percy by then. Good luck to you, friend. Have no fear for me." Lightly she mounted the rickety wooden steps that led to the attic. Brogard was taking no further heed of her. She could make herself comfortable there or not as she chose. Sir Andrew watched her until she had reached the loft and sat down upon the straw. She pulled the tattered curtains across, and the young man noted that she was singularly well placed there, for seeing and hearing, whilst remaining unobserved. He had paid Brogard well. The surly old innkeeper would have no object in betraying her. Then Sir Andrew prepared to go. At the door he turned once again and looked up at the loft. Through the ragged curtains Marguerite's sweet face was peeping down at him, and the young man rejoiced to see that it looked serene, and even gently smiling. With a final nod of farewell to her, he walked out into the night. Chapter 24. The Death Trap. The next quarter of an hour went by swiftly and noiselessly. In the room downstairs, Brogard had for a while busied himself with clearing the table and rearranging it for another guest. It was because she watched these preparations that Marguerite found the time slipping by more pleasantly. It was for Percy that this semblance of supper was being got ready. Evidently Brogard had a certain amount of respect for the tall Englishman, as he seemed to take some trouble in making the place look a trifle less uninviting than it had done before. He even produced, from some hidden recess in the old dresser, what actually looked like a tablecloth, and when he spread it out and saw it was full of holes, he shook his head dubiously for a while, then was at much pains so to spread it over the table as to hide most of its blemishes. Then he got out a serviette, also old and ragged, but possessing some measure of cleanliness, and with this he carefully wiped the glasses, spoons, and plates which he put on the table. Marguerite could not help smiling to herself as she watched all these preparations, which Brogard accomplished to an accompaniment of muttered oaths. Clearly the great height and bulk of the Englishman, or perhaps the weight of his fist, had overawed this free-born citizen of France, or he would never have been at such trouble for any sacre aristo. When the table was set, such as it was, Brogard surveyed it with evident satisfaction. He then dusted one of the chairs with the corner of his blouse, gave a stir to the stockpot, threw a fresh bundle of faggots onto the fire, and slouched out of the room. Marguerite was left alone with her reflections. She had spread her traveling cloak over the straw, and was sitting fairly comfortably, as the straw was fresh, and the evil odors from below came up to her only in a modified form. But, momentarily, she was almost happy. Happy because, when she peeped through the tattered curtains, she could see a rickety chair, a torn tablecloth, a glass, a plate, and a spoon. That was all. But those mute and ugly things seemed to say to her that they were waiting for Percy, that soon, very soon, he would be here, that the squalid room being still empty, they would be alone together. That thought was so heavenly that Marguerite closed her eyes in order to shut out everything but that. In a few minutes she would be alone with him. She would run down the ladder and let him see her. Then he would take her in his arms, and she would let him see that, after that, she would gladly die for him, and with him, for earth could hold no greater happiness than that. And then what would happen? She could not even remotely conjecture. She knew, of course, that Sir Andrew was right, that Percy would do everything he had set out to accomplish, that she, now she was here, could do nothing beyond warning him to be cautious, since Chauvelin himself was on his track. After having cautioned him, she would perforce have to see him go off upon his terrible and daring mission. She could not even with a word or look attempt to keep him back. She would have to obey whatever he told her to do, even perhaps have to efface herself, and wait in indescribable agony, whilst he, perhaps, went to his death. But even that seemed less terrible to bear than the thought that he should never know how much she loved him, that at any rate would be spared her. The squalid room itself, which seemed to be waiting for him, told her that he would be here soon. Suddenly her oversensitive ears caught the sound of distant footsteps drawing near. Her heart gave a wild leap of joy. Was it Percy at last? No. The step did not seem quite as long, nor quite as firm as his. She also thought that she could hear two distinct sets of footsteps. Yes, that was it. Two men were coming this way. Two strangers, perhaps, to get a drink, or... But she had not time to conjecture, for presently there was a peremptory call at the door, and the next moment it was violently thrown open from the outside, whilst a rough, commanding voice shouted, "Hey, Citoyen Brogard!" Hola! Marguerite could not see the newcomers, but, through a hole in one of the curtains, she could observe one portion of the room below. She heard Brogard's shuffling footsteps as he came out of the inner room, muttering his usual string of oaths. On seeing the strangers, however, he paused in the middle of the room, well within range of Marguerite's vision, looked at them with even more withering contempt than he had bestowed upon his former guests, and muttered, "Sacré Souton." Marguerite's heart seemed all at once to stop beating. Her eyes, large and dilated, had fastened on one of the newcomers, who, at this point, had taken a quick step forward towards Brogard. He was dressed in the soutane, broad-brimmed hat, and buckled shoes habitual to the French cure, but as he stood opposite the innkeeper, he threw open his soutane for a moment, displaying the tricolor scarf of officialism, which sight immediately had the effect of transforming Brogard's attitude of contempt into one of cringing obsequiousness. It was the sight of this French cure which seemed to freeze the very blood in Marguerite's veins. She could not see his face, which was shaded by his broad-brimmed hat, but she recognized the thin, bony hands, the slight stoop, the whole gait of the man. It was Chauvelin. The horror of the situation struck her as with a physical blow. The awful disappointment, the dread of what was to come, made her very senses reel, and she needed almost superhuman effort not to fall senseless beneath it all. "A plate of soup and a bottle of wine," said Chauvelin imperiously to Brogard. "Then clear out of here. Understand? I want to be alone." Silently, and without any muttering this time, Brogard obeyed. Chauvelin sat down at the table, which had been prepared for the tall Englishman, and the innkeeper busied himself obsequiously round him, dishing up the soup and pouring out the wine. The man who had entered with Chauvelin, and whom Marguerite could not see, stood waiting close by the door. At a brusque sign from Chauvelin, Brogard had hurried back to the inner room, and the former now beckoned to the man who had accompanied him. In him, Marguerite at once recognized Desgas, Chauvelin's secretary and confidential factotum, whom she had often seen in Paris in the days gone by. He crossed the room, and for a moment or two listened attentively at the Brogard's door. Not listening, asked Chauvelin curtly. No, citoyen. For a second Marguerite dreaded lest Chauvelin should order Desgas to search the place. What would happen if she were to be discovered? She hardly dared to imagine. Fortunately, however, Chauvelin seemed more impatient to talk to his secretary than afraid of spies, for he called Desgas quickly back to his side. The English schooner? He asked. She was lost sight of at sundown, citoyen, replied Desgas, but was then making west, towards Cap Gris-Nez. Ah, good, muttered Chauvelin, and now about Captain Jutley. What did he say? He assured me that all the orders you sent him last week have been implicitly obeyed. All the roads which converge to this place have been patrolled night and day ever since, and the beach and cliffs have been most rigorously searched and guarded. Does he know where this Père Blanchard's hut is? No, citoyen, nobody seems to know of it by that name. There are any amount of fishermen's huts all along the coast, of course, but that'll do. Now about tonight? Interrupted Chauvelin, impatiently. The roads and the beach are patrolled as usual, citoyen, and Captain Jutley awaits further orders. Go back to him at once, then. Tell him to send reinforcements to the various patrols, and especially to those along the beach, you understand? Chauvelin spoke curtly and to the point, and every word he uttered struck at Marguerite's heart like the death knell of her fondest hopes. The men, he continued, are to keep the sharpest possible lookout for any stranger who may be walking, riding, or driving, along the road or the beach, more especially for a tall stranger, whom I need not describe further, as probably he will be disguised, but he cannot very well conceal his height, except by stooping. You understand? Perfectly, citoyen, replied Desgas. As soon as any of the men have sighted a stranger, two of them are to keep him in view. The man who loses sight of the tall stranger, after he is once seen, will pay for his negligence with his life. But one man is to ride straight back here and report to me. Is that clear? Absolutely clear, citoyen. Very well, then. Go and see Jutley at once. See the reinforcements start off for the patrol duty, then ask the captain to let you have half a dozen more men and bring them here with you. You can be back in 10 minutes. Go! Desgas saluted and went to the door. As Marguerite, sick with horror, listened to Chauvelin's directions to his underling, the whole of the plan for the capture of the Scarlet Pimpernel became appallingly clear to her. Chauvelin wished that the fugitives should be left in false security, waiting in their hidden retreat until Percy joined them. Then the daring plotter was to be surrounded and caught red-handed, in the very act of aiding and abetting royalists, who were traitors to the Republic. Thus, if his capture were noised abroad, even the British government could not legally protest in his favor. Having plotted with the enemies of the French government, France had the right to put him to death. Escape for him and them would be impossible. All the roads patrolled and watched, the trap well set, the net, wide at present, but drawing together tighter and tighter, until it closed upon the daring plotter, whose superhuman cunning even could not rescue him from its meshes now. Desgas was about to go, but Chauvelin once more called him back. Marguerite vaguely wondered what further devilish plans he could have formed in order to entrap one brave man, alone, against 20 others. She looked at him as he turned to speak to Desgas. She could just see his face beneath the broad-brimmed cuirass hat. There was at that moment so much deadly hatred, such fiendish malice in the thin face and pale, small eyes, that Marguerite's last hope died in her heart, for she felt that from this man she could expect no mercy. I had forgotten, repeated Chauvelin, with a weird chuckle, as he rubbed his bony, talon-like hands one against the other, with a gesture of fiendish satisfaction. The tall stranger may show fight. In any case, no shooting, remember, except as a last resort. I want that tall stranger alive, if possible. He laughed, as Dante has told us that the devils laugh at sight of the torture of the damned. Marguerite had thought that by now she had lived through the whole gamut of horror and anguish that human heart could bear. Yet now, when Desgas left the house, and she remained alone in this lonely, squalid room. With that fiend for company, she felt as if all that she had suffered was nothing compared with this. He continued to laugh and chuckle to himself for a while, rubbing his hands together in anticipation of his triumph. His plans were well laid, and he might well triumph. Not a loophole was left through which the bravest, the most cunning man might escape. Every road guarded, every corner watched, and in that lonely hut somewhere on the coast, a small band of fugitives waiting for their rescuer, and leading him to his death, nay, to worse than death. That fiend there, in a holy man's garb, was too much of a devil to allow a brave man to die the quick, sudden death of a soldier at the post of duty. He, above all, longed to have the cunning enemy, who had so long baffled him, helpless in his power. He wished to gloat over him, to enjoy his downfall, to inflict upon him what moral and mental torture a deadly hatred alone can devise. The brave eagle, captured and with noble wings clipped, was doomed to endure the gnawing of the rat. And she, his wife, who loved him and who had brought him to this, could do nothing to help him. Nothing, save to hope for death by his side, and for one brief moment in which to tell him that her love, whole, true, and passionate, was entirely his. Chauvelin was now sitting close to the table. He had taken off his hat, and Marguerite could just see the outline of his thin profile and pointed chin as he bent over his meager supper. He was evidently quite contented and awaited events with perfect calm. He even seemed to enjoy Brogard's unsavory fare. Marguerite wondered how so much hatred could lurk in one human being against another. Suddenly, as she watched Chauvelin, a sound caught her ear, which turned her very heart to stone. And yet that sound was not calculated to inspire anyone with horror, for it was merely the cheerful sound of a gay, fresh voice singing lustily, "God Save the King." Chapter 25. The Eagle and the Fox. Marguerite's breath stopped short. She seemed to feel her very life standing still momentarily while she listened to that voice and to that song. In the singer she had recognized her husband. Chauvelin, too, had heard it, for he darted a quick glance towards the door, then hurriedly took up his broad-brimmed hat and clapped it over his head. The voice drew nearer. For one brief second the wild desire seized Marguerite to rush down the steps and fly across the room, to stop that song at any cost, to beg the cheerful singer to fly for his life, before it be too late. She checked the impulse just in time. Chauvelin would stop her before she reached the door, and moreover, she had no idea if he had any soldiers posted within his call. Her impetuous act might prove the death signal of the man she would have died to save. "Long to reign over us, God save the king," sang the voice more lustily than ever. The next moment the door was thrown open, and there was dead silence for a second or so. Marguerite could not see the door. She held her breath, trying to imagine what was happening. Percy Blakeney on entering had, of course, at once caught sight of the cure at the table. His hesitation lasted less than 5 seconds. The next moment Marguerite saw his tall figure crossing the room, whilst he called in a loud, cheerful voice. "Hello there? No one about? Where's that fool Brogard?" He wore the magnificent coat and riding suit which he had on when Marguerite last saw him at Richmond so many hours ago. As usual, his get-up was absolutely irreproachable. The fine Mechlin lace at his neck and wrists was immaculate in its gossamer daintiness. His hands looked slender and white. His fair hair was carefully brushed, and he carried his eyeglass with his usual affected gesture. In fact, at this moment, Sir Percy Blakeney Bart might have been on his way to a garden party at the Prince of Wales, instead of deliberately, cold-bloodedly running his head in a trap set for him by his deadliest enemy. He stood for a moment in the middle of the room, whilst Marguerite, absolutely paralyzed with horror, seemed unable even to breathe. Every moment she expected that Chauvelin would give a signal, that the place would fill with soldiers, that she would rush down and help Percy to sell his life dearly. As he stood there, suavely unconscious, she very nearly screamed out to him, "Fly, Percy! 'Tis your deadly enemy! Fly before it be too late!" But she had not time even to do that, for the next moment Blakeney quietly walked to the table, and, jovially clapping the cure on the back, said in his own drawly, affected way. "Odds fish, Chauvelin. I vow I never thought of meeting you here." Chauvelin, who had been in the very act of conveying soup to his mouth, fairly choked. His thin face became absolutely purple, and a violent fit of coughing saved this cunning representative of France from betraying the most boundless surprise he had ever experienced. There was no doubt that this bold move on the part of the enemy had been wholly unexpected, as far as he was concerned, and the daring impudence of it completely nonplussed him for the moment. Obviously, he had not taken the precaution of having the inn surrounded with soldiers. Blakeney had evidently guessed that much, and no doubt his resourceful brain had already formed some plan by which he could turn this unexpected interview to account. Marguerite up in the loft had not moved. She had made a solemn promise to Sir Andrew not to speak to her husband before strangers, and she had sufficient self-control not to throw herself unreasoningly and impulsively across his plans. To sit still and watch these two men together was a terrible trial of fortitude. Marguerite had heard Chauvelin give the orders for the patrolling of all the roads. She knew that if Percy now left the Château, in whichever direction he happened to go, he could not go far without being sighted by some of Captain Jutley's men on patrol. On the other hand, if he stayed, then Desgas would have time to come back with the half-dozen men Chauvelin had specially ordered. The trap was closing in, and Marguerite could do nothing but watch and wonder. The two men looked such a strange contrast, and of the two, it was Chauvelin who exhibited a slight touch of fear. Marguerite knew him well enough to guess what was passing in his mind. He had no fear for his own person, although he certainly was alone in a lonely inn with a man who was powerfully built and who was daring and reckless beyond the bounds of probability. She knew that Chauvelin would willingly have braved perilous encounters for the sake of the cause he had at heart, but what he did fear was that this impudent Englishman would, by knocking him down, double his own chances of escape. His underlings might not succeed so well in capturing the Scarlet Pimpernel when not directed by the cunning hand and the shrewd brain, which had deadly hate for an incentive. Evidently, however, the representative of the French government had nothing to fear for the moment at the hands of his powerful adversary. Blakeney, with his most inane laugh and pleasant good nature, was solemnly patting him on the back. "I am so demmed sorry," he was saying cheerfully, "so very sorry. I seem to have upset you. Eating soup too. Nasty, awkward thing, soup. Begad, a friend of mine died once, choked, just like you, with a spoonful of soup," and he smiled shyly, good-humoredly, down at Chauvelin. "Odds life," he continued, as soon as the latter had somewhat recovered himself. "Beastly hole this, ain't it now? La! You don't mind?" he added, apologetically, as he sat down on a chair close to the table and drew the soup tureen towards him. "That fool Brogard seems to be asleep or something." There was a second plate on the table, and he calmly helped himself to soup, then poured himself out a glass of wine. For a moment Marguerite wondered what Chauvelin would do. His disguise was so good that perhaps he meant, on recovering himself, to deny his identity. But Chauvelin was too astute to make such an obviously false and childish move, and already he too had stretched out his hand and said pleasantly, "I am indeed charmed to see you, Sir Percy. You must excuse me. I thought you the other side of the channel." Sudden surprise almost took my breath away. "La," said Sir Percy with a good-humored grin, "it did that quite, didn't it? Did her Chobberden? Pardon me, Chauvelin. I beg pardon 1,000 times. Yes, Chauvelin, of course. I never could cotton to foreign names." He was calmly eating his soup, laughing with pleasant good humor, as if he had come all the way to Calais for the express purpose of enjoying supper at this filthy inn, in the company of his archenemy. For the moment Marguerite wondered why Percy did not knock the little Frenchman down then and there. And no doubt something of the sort must have darted through his mind, for every now and then his lazy eyes seemed to flash ominously as they rested on the slight figure of Chauvelin, who had now quite recovered himself and was also calmly eating his soup. But the keen brain, which had planned and carried through so many daring plots, was too far-seeing to take unnecessary risks. This place, after all, might be infested with spies. The innkeeper might be in Chauvelin's pay. One call on Chauvelin's part might bring 20 men about Blakeney's ears for aught he knew, and he might be caught and trapped before he could help or, at least, warn the fugitives. This he would not risk. He meant to help the others, to get them safely away, for he had pledged his word to them, and his word he would keep. And whilst he ate and chatted, he thought and planned, whilst, up in the loft, the poor, anxious woman racked her brain as to what she should do, and endured agonies of longing to rush down to him, yet not daring to move for fear of upsetting his plans. "I didn't know," Blakeney was saying jovially, "that you were in holy orders." Him," stammered Chauvelin. The calm impudence of his antagonist had evidently thrown him off his usual balance. "But I should have known you anywhere," continued Sir Percy, placidly, as he poured himself out another glass of wine, "although the wig and hat have changed you a bit." "Do you think so?" "Lud, they alter a man so. But, begad, I hope you don't mind my having made the remark." "Demmed bad form, making remarks. I hope you don't mind?" No, not at all, him." "I hope Lady Blakeney is well," said Chauvelin, hurriedly changing the topic of conversation. Blakeney, with much deliberation, finished his plate of soup, drank his glass of wine, and momentarily, it seemed to Marguerite as if he glanced quickly all round the room. "Quite well, thank you," he said at last, drily. There was a pause, during which Marguerite could watch these two antagonists who, evidently in their minds, were measuring themselves against one another. She could see Percy almost full face where he sat at the table, not 10 yards from where she herself was crouching, puzzled, not knowing what to do or what she should think. She had quite controlled her impulse by now of rushing down and disclosing herself to her husband. A man capable of acting a part, in the way he was doing at the present moment, did not need a woman's word to warn him to be cautious. Marguerite indulged in the luxury, dear to every tender woman's heart, of looking at the man she loved. She looked through the tattered curtain, across at the handsome face of her husband, in whose lazy blue eyes and behind whose inane smile she could now so plainly see the strength, energy, and resourcefulness which had caused the Scarlet Pimpernel to be reverenced and trusted by his followers. "There are 19 of us ready to lay down our lives for your husband, Lady Blakeney," Sir Andrew had said to her. And as she looked at the forehead, low, but square and broad, the eyes blue, yet deep-set and intense, the whole aspect of the man, of indomitable energy, hiding behind a perfectly acted comedy, his almost superhuman strength of will and marvelous ingenuity. She understood the fascination which he exercised over his followers. For had he not also cast his spells over her heart? In her imagination, Chauvelin, who was trying to conceal his impatience beneath his usual urbane manner, took a quick look at his watch. Desgas should not be long, another 2 or 3 minutes, and this impudent Englishman would be secure in the keeping of half a dozen of Captain Jutley's most trusted men. "You are on your way to Paris, Sir Percy?" he asked carelessly. "Odds life, no," replied Blakeney with a laugh. "Only as far as Lille. Not Paris for me. Beastly uncomfortable place, Paris. Just now, Monsieur Chaubertin, beg pardon." "Chauvelin, not for an English gentleman like yourself, Sir Percy," rejoined Chauvelin, sarcastically, who takes no interest in the conflict that is raging there. You see it's no business of mine, and our demmed government is all on your side of the business. Old Pitt daren't say bo to a goose. You are in a hurry, sir," he added, as Chauvelin once again took out his watch. "An appointment, perhaps. I pray you take no heed of me. My time's my own." He rose from the table and dragged a chair to the hearth. Once more Marguerite was terribly tempted to go to him, for time was getting on. Desgas might be back at any moment with his men. Percy did not know that, and oh, how horrible it all was, and how helpless she felt. "I am in no hurry," continued Percy, pleasantly, "but I don't want to spend any more time than I can help in this godforsaken hole. But, begad, sir," he added, as Chauvelin had surreptitiously looked at his watch for the 3rd time, "that watch of yours won't go any faster for all the looking you give it. You are expecting a friend, maybe?" "I have friend, not a lady, I trust, Monsieur Abbé," laughed Blakeney. "Surely the Holy Church does not allow—" "What? But I say, come by the fire. It's getting demmed cold." He kicked the fire with the heel of his boot, making the logs blaze in the old hearth. He seemed in no hurry to go, and apparently was quite unconscious of his immediate danger. He dragged another chair to the fire, and Chauvelin, whose impatience was by now quite beyond control, sat down beside the hearth, in such a way as to command a view of the door. Desgas had been gone nearly a quarter of an hour. It was quite plain to Marguerite's aching senses that as soon as he arrived, Chauvelin would abandon all his other plans with regard to the fugitives, and capture this impudent Scarlet Pimpernel at once. "Hey, Chauvelin," the latter was saying airily. "Tell me, I pray you, is your friend pretty? Dem smart these little Frenchwomen sometimes, what? But I protest I need not ask," he added, as he carelessly strode back towards the supper table. "In matters of taste the church has never been backward." But Chauvelin was not listening. His every faculty was now concentrated on that door through which presently Desgas would enter. Marguerite's thoughts, too, were centered there, for her ears had suddenly caught, through the stillness of the night, the sound of numerous and measured treads some distance away. It was Desgas and his men. Another 3 minutes, and they would be here. Another 3 minutes, and the awful thing would have occurred. The brave eagle would have fallen in the ferret's trap. She would have moved now and screamed, but she dared not, for whilst she heard the soldiers approaching, she was looking at Percy and watching his every movement. He was standing by the table whereon the remnants of the supper, plates, glasses, spoons, salt and pepper pots were scattered pell-mell. His back was turned to Chauvelin, and he was still prattling along in his own affected and inane way, but from his pocket he had taken his snuff-box, and quickly and suddenly he emptied the contents of the pepper pot into it. Then he again turned with an inane laugh to Chauvelin. Did you speak, sir?" Chauvelin had been too intent on listening to the sound of those approaching footsteps to notice what his cunning adversary had been doing. He now pulled himself together, trying to look unconcerned in the very midst of his anticipated triumph. "No," he said presently, "that is, as you were saying, Sir Percy." "I was saying," said Blakeney, going up to Chauvelin by the fire, "that the Jew in Piccadilly has sold me better snuff this time than I have ever tasted. Will you honor me, Monsieur l'Abbé?" He stood close to Chauvelin in his own careless, debonair way, holding out his snuff-box to his archenemy. Chauvelin, who, as he told Marguerite once, had seen a trick or two in his day, had never dreamed of this one. With one ear fixed on those fast-approaching footsteps, one eye turned to that door where Desgas and his men would presently appear, lulled in a false security by the impudent Englishman's airy manner. He never even remotely guessed the trick which was being played upon him. He took a pinch of snuff. Only he, who has ever by accident sniffed vigorously a dose of pepper, can have the faintest conception of the hopeless condition in which such a sniff would reduce any human being. Chauvelin felt as if his head would burst. Sneeze after sneeze seemed nearly to choke him. He was blind, deaf, and dumb for the moment, and during that moment Blakeney quietly, without the slightest haste, took up his hat, took some money out of his pocket, which he left on the table, then calmly stalked out of the room.